Hi, I'm Jan Doyle. Welcome to Classroom Connections. I'm honored to have today's guests on our show today. We have four distinguished gentlemen who are leaders in the educational field across Connecticut. I'm going to introduce them and then we'll start our conversation. And I think I'll start with the gentleman to my left, which is Hamlet Hernandez.
Hi, Jan.
Hi, welcome back.
Thank you.
Hamlet is the superintendent of Branford Schools and no stranger to Classroom Connections.
No, not at all.
Our next guest is Scott Schoonmaker,
Correct.
who is the superintendent of North Branford Schools, and it's your first visit to Classroom Connections.
Yes, it is, and I thank you for inviting me.
I'm thrilled that you're here. Our next guest is Dr. Joseph Cirasuolo, who is the executive director of the Connecticut Association of Public School Superintendents. And I have to use my fingers when I say that because otherwise I wouldn't remember it. But from now on, I'm going to use an acronym which is CAPSS.
Right.
Even I can remember CAPSS. Welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here.
I'm so happy you're back again. And our last guest today is David Calchera, who is Director of Public Policy for CAPSS, and who also happens to know by heart 7 years ago. So I am so impressed. And thank you so much for coming, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me.
Today's conversation, there's so much going on in education, and it's constantly changing. And I was just reading a quote somewhere that many people become concerned with constant change. And one way to make them feel comfortable with change is to have outstanding leadership. And I think that's exemplified by the gentleman sitting here at the table. So we're going to talk about what's changing in Connecticut, and there's a CAPSS is interested in something called the Educational Transformation Project. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Joe,
that's easier. Yeah.
Thank you. Why don't we start with you, and can you explain it for us, please?
Well, the project was started, I think it's 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago. We decided that instead of just being against things that other people propose, and instead of reacting to things only in terms of themselves, we needed some vision for what we wanted schooling to be in the state of Connecticut. So we asked our members to identify for us the major educational issues that we needed to address. And the number one thing by far that they identified was the need to transform schooling, based on a judgment that we are now expected to produce a result where every child, no excuses, no exceptions, every child learns what they need to know and be able to do to lead decent lives and productive lives. The buzzwords now are college and career ready. Next year will be something else, but that's a high expectation. Every child meeting high standards. We're not designed to produce that. Our system is designed to give every kid a chance, but whether they learn it or not sort of is up to them. So that's what our members identified. To address that, Dave and I put together, along with Larry Schaefer, a guy we brought on board to help us out, actually run the project, 16 of our members, and said to them, your job is to come up with a blueprint for transforming schooling in the state of Connecticut. They worked at it for a couple of years. It came up with a series of recommendations, 134 of them to be exact. But they're all centered around one idea, that we need to go from what we have now to what we're calling a learner-centered or personalized system of education. That means basically three things. One, that we reverse the relationship between time and learning. Right now, time is the constant, learning is the variable. And so we make learning the constant, time the variable. That really means that every child gets the time they need to master what they have to master, whether it's content or skills. And they move through the process at a pace appropriate for them, not based on how old they are or getting an average of 70 on something or things of that type. And they don't leave schooling until they've demonstrated they've got the skills and the knowledge that we think they ought to have. So some kids will be with us for 13 years, as they are now, some for 10, some maybe 15, and what happens during the year will vary as well. The second thing it means is that we will teach kids in a way that's consistent with their primary learning style. Right now we basically teach them one way. If If you happen to learn best the way we teach, you do very well.
Which is the lecture style.
Well, that is more than lectures. A lot of group work going on now. But it's very much a teacher-centered style, no matter how you put it.
Yes, it is.
There are kids who learn in different ways at different times. So we need to provide for children many more options than we do now. And we can't be limited by the normal length of a school day, the normal length of a school year, or even by the building itself. The buildings are necessary, but there are a lot of things that some youngsters can do outside the building that's more consistent with how they will learn. And finally, we need to key things into, as much as possible, what young people are interested in. We all know we learn better that in which we're interested as opposed to stuff we're not interested in.
Exactly.
Those three things call for a major change in how we do business, and we tried to capture that change in the 134 recommendations. And we can go into some detail on that if you want to, but that's basically what the project is all about. We rolled it out last November. We were pleased to see that a number of the things that we were proposing sort of made their way into the governor's proposals, the commissioner's positions, some of the stuff that came out of the legislature. And we made some progress last year in the legislature moving towards a personalized system of learning. We have a lot more work to do, but at least we've gotten off the ground with it.
Yes, you're talking about a major change within an organization that has been based on really a farmer or help me with the word, agrarian society. How much do you think technology has to play in this, or will allow this to happen?
It's going to be huge. Without it, we're not going to be able to do it. I mean, the technology is there now for us to track every youngster in terms of whatever continuum they're on and to loop them into the experiences they need. We just don't use it for that purpose. We use a lot of technology in schooling, some districts more than others. But initially, at least, we used it to make things, what we're doing now, more interesting and to be a little more efficient.
Yes,
but,
yes, we have.
We haven't really used it to change the learning design. We have 30 districts this year working on a project to do just that. They're working with actually an international expert, a guy named Alan November, to start changing how they do things. So technology is not used just for its own sake, but we change the learning design and then say, how do we use technology to make that happen?
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, let me just go to Mr. Hernandez. How does this look like in your school? He has some wonderful ideas, and it's broad-based, but what does it look like in the Branford school system?
I'd like to pick up where Joe left off regarding technology. We have just recently adopted a 5-year new technology plan that really embraces those principles, those tenets. Primarily when I think about at the elementary school, and you've heard me speak about this, touch technology, and what does that mean to the learner at the elementary level. One-to-one, what does that mean at the intermediate level? And then to bring your own device. And that's a conceptual framework. Just saying those buzzwords is not enough. We also in Branford this year, we are in the process of hiring a technology integration specialist that works directly with our teachers so that the technology, and really it's not technology as much as it is access to information, relevant and meaningful information that enhances the learning process for those learners that frankly may learn differently in our classroom. So the combination of differentiating instruction, leveraging technology appropriately at different levels, I think makes a better learner. We will have a child reach their potential. And then of course something that in the transformation project that really gives birth to what you see now as student success plans. That really is that individualized piece. Right now we're looking at the high school and intermediate school, but I do see a day in which every child, similar to right now in special education, we have an individualized educational plan.
Yes.
I think we will move to individualized success plans for our students.
If you have some
that are fluid.
If you have something like that, do you have to increase the staff to be able to manage that, or do you think that's going to be a classroom teacher can handle?
Well, that's a great question because if I had the answer to it, I would probably be speaking nationally. I don't have the answer to that.
I thought you knew everything.
No, ask my wife. She'll tell you. I don't know everything.
Okay.
But I will tell you, I think the initial inclination is to think that if we're changing the paradigm, that we need new staff. I'll often talk about, and the transformation plan actually mentions this, repurposing resources and looking at things perhaps differently and looking at the existing resources that we have before we actually start asking for new resources. So it is a matter of doing things differently, and of course that means professional development, continuous training, and continuous assessment to determine what is successful and what is not. So the answer to that question, as my board attorney always tells me, could be yes, could be no.
That covers everything. How about in the North Branford school systems? What does it look like for you, Scott?
We're similar to Branford in how we're initiating change and technology. You've heard the one-to-one initiative and acceptable use policies, and we've done many site visits, and we're very interested in the iPad and the applications that associate with the iPad for regular ed and special ed students. Hopefully in the next 2 years, our incoming freshmen will be working off of the iPad. The teachers will be well-versed, and you'll see a shift, and there's many districts in the state of Connecticut now that have fully implemented this initiative, and they're moving with it. Brookville High School comes to mind. I did a site visit there, and the teachers interact with the students. All work is collected. When they get up to present a PowerPoint, it's from the iPad. They do their note-taking and research right there from it. So we're seeing this shift in this paradigm, and we want to stay ahead of the curve. And you know, we're looking to do that, and many other things. The smart board was the greatest piece of technology that came out, you know, several years back, and you're seeing, you know, the change and the shift there with the iPad and its usage. So
Someone told me the smart board is on its way out.
well, I think as we continue to move forward with technology and efficiency and things that we're speaking to, the iPad is much more affordable. It's interactive with the entire group during the lesson time, and you can accomplish the same goals as you do with the smart board.
So then I suppose buying chalkboards is no longer in your
Thing of the
budget.
past.
Okay, fine. Fine. What do you, Dave, you're talking about public policy and you interact a great deal with the governor. What insights can you give this viewing audience about how the governor is working on these things that Joe has told us about?
Well, Joe said that we rolled this out last November, and as luck would have it, although we started 3 years earlier when nobody knew what the word transformation meant, all of a sudden last year everybody was interested in educational transformation. So we had a governor that clearly indicated it was going to be the year of education. We had our report on the table, and many other groups, advocacy groups in Connecticut, were pushing in the same direction. And in retrospect, we were in the right place at the right time to have an impact on what the governor developed. I would hasten to say that the governor needs no help with developing his own programs. He's a bold, visionary governor who knew where he wanted to go. I think, however, our putting our plan on the table allowed the governor and his staff to take perhaps a wider and deeper look at systemic change than they first had in mind. So in that sense, I do think that we impacted maybe not specific elements of the governor's proposal, but the tenor of the proposal, which became much more systemic than it would have been. The resulting public act ran 145 pages and touched so much inside education that it will take us a while to absorb it. So in that sense, I think that our report and the governor's presentation to the General Assembly and their input as well was really synergistic.
And I also heard you say something that I hear from the rank and file, the resistance. I think people have worked through all the resistance to this change, and are most of it, and they're starting to come along with the parents and the teachers, which are trying to implement all the changes that the governor and CAP is suggesting.
I think if we did one single thing last year in November, and as Joe said, we rolled it out in November, that means that he and I and Larry and others probably went to as many as 25 or 30 meetings of stakeholders around the state expressing our plan. I think if we did one thing as a result of that, it was to demonstrate that the debate about whether or not we need to move to a new future is over.
Absolutely.
The question
Yes,
now is
it is.
how and when, and that's where you see some struggle. Every industry, whether it's education or business or medicine or law, struggles with major change.
Everybody does.
Everybody does. Health is going through that now, and I think the parallels are very interesting when hospitals or doctors are now being rewarded for patient outcomes, not the procedures they employ. It's an interesting parallel to what's happening in education.
Absolutely.
We are interested in student outcomes, and it can take the teaching and instruction can take many different forms in a personalized way. But that's a very different paradigm, and change is always uncomfortable. Even if you're a secure person, the thought of change is difficult, and that's what we'll be struggling with for a year or two.
I once had a professor that, God knows what his name was, but God knows, I can't even remember. But he had a quote that I remember distinctly. There's only one person that likes change, and that's a baby. And so everybody else doesn't care for it. I wish I could remember his name.
Sometimes they resist it too.
Yes, that is true. Thank you. Now, the news, when you were talking about your rollout last year, the news really highlighted one particular aspect, and teachers' unions were involved, and that kind of held up the process at the state, was teacher evaluation. What change do you see has happened with that, with the teacher evaluation?
I will give you a little set, and then I'm going to hand that over to Joe, who's been very active on a state group that's been working on teacher evaluation. But the set I will give you is that. Well, let me just kick it to Joe, because he's had much more direct experience with that process than I have.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we've accomplished, at least in policy, the paradigm shift. Up until this point, we've been held accountable for what we do, how we taught, how we gave out materials, how we managed the classroom and all that. And
Yes.
that's still there. But now we're also being held responsible for the results of that. I was an English teacher years ago, and one of the things I taught was the elements of a novel. And people made sure I taught the elements accurately and clearly, but nobody ever bothered to find out whether my kids learned the elements of a novel. I did. I gave tests and that kind of stuff. But mostly it was to either reward or punish the kids. The kids who learned it got A's. Those who were sort of in the middle got a C. And if you didn't learn it, even though I may not have taught it all that well, you got an F. Now we're being held accountable for whether the kids actually learned the elements of a novel and other stuff. So in the new evaluation system, 45% of a teacher or a principal's evaluation will be based on growth in student achievement, multiply measured, not just a single test score or anything like that, but at least two ways of determining whether students under a teacher's purview or the whole school under a principal's leadership, whether they've grown in learning. And growth is an important concept to emphasize here, because this is not a question of expecting every kid to be at the same place on a given day. We take the kids from where they are when they enter. They're going to be entering school in the next week or two, do some assessment there as to where they are, set some reasonable goals for them to grow in achievement by June, and then benchmark that along the way. That's basically the system. And so teachers are involved in that. It's very much a collaborative thing with teachers and evaluators, and they will work out reasonable goals for growth in student achievement. But at the end, when those goals are not met, then obviously either the teacher or the principal needs to be held accountable. But more importantly, when they are met, they are to be congratulated. We hope at some point in the future that goes beyond congratulation to something that's some kind of systemic reward for doing that. And in addition, all the way along, there has to be support for the teachers and the principals. This isn't a gotcha kind of situation. In fact, the whole purpose in it is to improve instruction, not to get rid of people.
I'd like to, if I may follow up on that for just a brief minute, Joe. If I have a regret about last year and last year's conversation, it is this. We very much believe that an effective teacher needs to be in every classroom, and an effective principal needs to provide support to those teachers. And you've heard Hamlet talk about repurposing staff to move towards supporting more effective teachers. By the same token, the whole system needs to be accountable, including teachers. Somehow that seemed to migrate into denigrating teachers and holding them individually responsible for whatever failures in public education we saw, which is the furthest thing from what we feel.
That's right.
And I hope we can begin this year by talking about how changes need to be made along the entire system, from policymakers to board members, superintendents, principals, classroom teachers. None of us are off the hook, but by concentrating on where the rubber meets the road in the classroom, we appear to be holding people more responsible than perhaps they should have been held by the public at large.
Well, that's a good point. And I just read something recently about the teacher leader and giving teachers more power, but not just because they're good. Many times what happens when you have a good teacher, they're out of the classroom. But to keep them in the classroom where they're needed the most and still help other teachers. So there's a lot of different strings to this system, and it's a huge job, because the bottom line is the most effective tool in the classroom is the teacher.
And the most valued asset that we have
Yes.
is the teacher.
Exactly. Now, I just had a comment about, maybe you can answer this, Hamlet. Joe talked about a child along the continuum. Obviously, there's all different abilities. And if you have a child not necessarily identified with a 504 or special ed, but still has limited abilities to progress with the rest of what's typically considered average child or average development, and the concern of teachers is, will the teachers be held accountable for something that cannot be accountable?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I fundamentally believe that every child that walks through our front doors has relative strengths and relative weaknesses, and that each child, regardless of their cognitive ability, has the inherent ability to learn. That is differentiated. If I understood your question correctly, is absent an identified disability or a significant impact to a life function, which is a 504, and a child is not progressing, will the teacher be held accountable? I think it's important to answer that question directly. The teacher will be held accountable for all of the learners in the classroom.
Okay,
so we're not going to pull certain learners out. The teachers will be responsible for all learners. I think that looks and presents itself through differentiation, where we set reasonable and achievable outcomes for our students, and that we need to measure. That you heard Joe and Dave talk about benchmarking. That's very, very important. That growth over time concept, I'm thrilled that the state is starting to look at that, and we haven't really talked about that here, but the new Connecticut accountability system really embraces that notion of
Well,
growth
let's go
over
into
time.
that a little bit, because we don't have that much time left. Can you tell me about the new Connecticut accountability system?
Well, I'm going to turn this over to Joe. I can tell you a little bit about it, okay? But
I just want to spin off on something
Sure.
that Hamlet was stating, and Joe mentioned about varying assessment and having multiple indicators, so that individual students have the ability to show their strengths and us to identify their weaknesses. And there's things that are happening, I know, in Branford, where in other districts, where we give the children the opportunity to take ownership of their learning through project-based learning, authentic
Okay.
learning, and in North Branford we have an IPP program where the students self-select, delve into, and then present using technology and a written performance piece. And those are things I think that we're speaking to with transformation, getting out of the traditional Carnegie unit, out of the 7:30 to 2 o'clock or 8 to 3, of kids learning outside of the school system, be it coursework or externships, internships, really breaking down the system that we're so accustomed to, and we're losing. The gap is growing because we're not able to individualize. And I think the transformation effort speaks to our ability to get the best and brightest, but then make these changes so there's no child left behind.
Well, that is a very good point, and this sounds like it's going to take years to fully implement. Did you want to speak to the new accountability system?
Well, I'll say a couple things about it. First of all, we now have what the state is calling the School Performance Index, which is a more complex way of identifying where schools stand in terms of their effectiveness. Growth is part of it. There's different tiers. It isn't just looking at one test score and saying you did well and you didn't do, or you didn't do well. That's a step in the right direction. Nobody is claiming we've reached nirvana with it, but it's better than what we have now.
Absolutely.
And the state is using that to identify those schools that really need a lot of help and intervention, that kind of thing. Keep that in mind as we also talk about the introduction of what's called the Common Core, which 45 states are doing, including Connecticut. That's a whole new set of curriculum standards that go across the board, will eventually go across the board. And they will be tied to a new assessment system that's called the Smarter Balance Assessment System.
I haven't heard that word before, that expression.
Yeah, well, up to this point, I thought it was a kind of margarine you could buy in the store. But it's now an assessment system as well.
I won't ever forget it now either.
Once I'm giving you a
Linked it to for me,
What do
yes.
they call it, mnemonics or something like that?
Yes, I'm very big with
You
that.
think of me, and it won't be Walt Disney, it'll be Smarter Balance, Marjorie. I appreciate that. That's a better image.
Yes.
That's assessment system. See, if we don't change how we assess kids, we're never going to personalize learning. Because right now, we expect every kid in 4th grade, for example, to be at a certain point in March of their 4th grade year. It doesn't make any sense. We know that can't happen, yet we keep expecting it. The Smarter Balance system has in it a lot more alternatives. So one, you could start testing kids in the same grade level at different times during the year when you think they're ready for it. We think that's a step in the right direction.
Wow.
And, I mean, if we use it the right way, and there are some alternative assessment mechanisms for those kids who the standard test is not the best way for them to demonstrate what they know, but they know it anyhow. There may be some other ways for them to do it. Now, again, the way I liken it is that those of us who were around in 1961 remember when Alan Shepard went into space?
Yes, yeah. I hate to say I was, but I was around.
You were probably in kindergarten.
We won't say what we were.
Yeah.
Our students.
The whole country, as you know, celebrated.
Yes.
Yet he was in no more than 2 or 3 hours in space. He didn't orbit the Earth once. But this was the first time we'd ever sent anybody up there. Everybody thought it was wonderful. But we all knew we needed a lot more work to get to the moon.
Right.
And we're in the same boat now. With the reform package that got passed, the stuff we're doing, stuff other folks are doing, they've gotten us analogously to where we were in 1961 in our ability to get to the moon. We just need to grow a lot more. Smarter Balance, Common Core will move us in that direction. There's going to be another generation, though, of standards. There's going to be another generation of assessments, maybe 3 or 4 others as we move forward. So maybe, I mean, we've sort of estimated that if we work hard and work smart, 10 years from now, we could look back and say, wow, things have really changed in how we do schooling. Now, along the way, we should see some changes as well. But to really institutionalize this thing, to get to what Gladwell calls the tipping point, where once you get to a point where people buy into it, then the results become things you can't even envision now.
Right.
It just has its own momentum to it.
Yes, yes.
We're hoping 5, 6, 7 years out we'll reach that tipping point, and then from that point on it's downhill in the right way, that things just start to move.
Joe, that's wonderful, and I'm going to have to interrupt because our time unbelievably is up. But I just want to comment that you have a very calming, grandfatherly way of making it all work out in the
That's
end.
a compliment.
That means I'm older.
That's better than Walt Disney.
I better rest seeing somebody dead to somebody old.
It's like,
You're moving on now.
everything's going to be okay. That's how I feel when I just listen to you. Don't have to worry about it. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming.
You're
I
most
so
welcome.
appreciate it. If you have any additional questions you'd like to ask, you can always email me at jmdteach@comcast.net or go to my website, www.classroomconnections365.com. Thank you. I know it's just the touch of the iceberg, but thank you for start getting the information out more. I really so appreciate it, gentlemen.
You're most welcome.
Thank
It was
you
my
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.